Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the forum discussion organized by Dravidian Professionals Forum. I'm Dharnidharan, Executive Coordinator of DPF, and I will be moderating today's discussion titled The Curious Case of Indian Federalism from Cooperative to Centralized. Indian federalism, since constituency was written post-independence, is an asymmetric federalism, or rather a paradox, meaning the union is not a league of states, nor are the states the agencies of the union, both deriving power from it. Both the union and the states are created by the constitution and both derive their respective responsibility from the constitution. Another interesting construct of a constitution is that though Tamil Nadu, Bengal, or other states have existed for more than thousands of years, the construction of states by constitution is arbitrary and is not based on these historical boundaries. Eventually, states were divided based on language and culture due to hue and cry from the regional parties, but that was not the intent of a constitution as such. Indian federalism has also taken different turns based on the construction of government at the center. We had one-party federalism until 65 under Nehru, and then it was conflictual federalism in the 70s and until the late 80s. And then we had multi-party federalism between 1989 to 2014. This is the only time it was a symmetric federalism or a symmetrical federalism. And then from 2014 onwards, it's two-men federalism. Though Congress under Nehru was much more powerful than under Modi, Nehru was considered enough to maintain the delicate balance of power between states and the center. However asymmetrical it could have been, or it was. But under Modi, everything is now changed under the slogan Hindu Rashtra. And under the help of institutions and the degradation of courts and other investigative agencies, the basic rights of states have been violated, and more so in the area of fiscal federalism. Example to this is, as per Vidi's Center for Legal Policy report, the share of revenues to the state's annual tax kitty from cess has risen to 12% nearly of the estimated gross tax receipts in the year 2018-19 from 6% in 2012. Same, even surcharge has been increased by more than 3 or 4 times from 2011 to 2021. So thereby depriving states of their revenue. Political scientist Philip Mehwood has argued that in culturally diverse developing country like India, federalism is chosen not merely for administrative requirements, but for survival of the nation itself. And whenever a central government has forced on the principle of one nation, the states have bounced back and federalism have survived. So 2024 would hold key, and we don't know in which direction Indian democracy or the federalism is going to go. But now we have a very interesting panel. Let me introduce the panel. We have in the panel the Honorable Minister, Dr. Palanivel Thiaga Rajan. He serves as the Minister for Finance and Human Resources in Government of Tamil Nadu. He was the founding secretary of DMK's IT wing. And before entering politics, he was the senior managing director of Standard Chartered Bank. He holds degrees from National Institute of Technology, Trichy, University of Buffalo, and MIT, where he did his MBA and the Sloan School of Management. Second speaker is Senator Derek O'Brien. He's a member of the upper house of the Indian Parliament, representing Trinamool Congress. He also serves the Trinamool party as his leader in the upper house. He's a voracious speaker, speaking regularly at universities such as Harvard, Yale, IIM, and IITs. In 2012, he was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. Then we have John Gerring. He's a professor of government at University of Texas, Austin. He focuses on comparative politics. He holds a PhD from University of California, Berkeley. And I eventually happened to read one of his research papers, and which was very relevant to the theme we're discussing. And when I wrote to him, and he was very happy to immediately join us for the discussion. And we also have Nikita Sood, who's an associate professor at University of Oxford. She's also the head for graduate admissions at Developmental Politics Department at Oxford. And unfortunately, she has a personal emergency, and she is heading to India, so she might join or she may not join. And finally, we have Aadhil Hussain, who has done his PhD at University of Oxford under Nikita Sood and currently works as an assistant professor at Ajim Premji University and originally hails from West Bengal and has does some work for TMC. The first would speak would be the Honorable Minister PTR Thiaga Rajan.
Thank you, Dharanidharan. And at the outset, my thanks to my good friend Derek O'Brien and to Professor Gerring and either Professor Sood or Junior for taking the time to join us today. The DPF was set up under the kind of slogan that ideas are the lifeblood of a movement, and that the Dravidian movement, which has lasted a century, which is quite a remarkable run for any movement, and run the government of Tamil Nadu for all but 30 of those 100 years in various parties' descendants, was in dire need of rejuvenation of ideas and a re-intellectualization of the political discourse. I am glad to say that despite very little involvement from me, the executive coordinators, Pugal Gandhi, the lawyer, and Dharanidharan, the globally educated management specialist, have done a very good job of really expanding the horizons and bringing in wonderful speakers like this panel from all over the world, and really setting the high watermark for the quality of debate. Thank you for that. Let me switch to the topic of hand. I really don't want to take too much time because I'm an active politician and a sitting minister. So, these are things that I say all the time, and I don't want to repeat myself and use up valuable time from the other panelists. So I'll just make about 3 or 4 points. The first, I think, is that despite the errors of federalism that Dharani pointed out, the greatest contradiction I see is the stance of the Honorable Prime Minister today, Mr. Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and the actions of his government, particularly after 2019, but even after 2014. We all recall that the 13 years that Mr. Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he was the greatest champion of states' rights and federalism. He was the most vocal. He was the most vociferous against the states, the union's intrusion, as he perceived it, in areas like GST, in NEET, in other places, in allocation of funds and so forth. The old adage, where one stands depends on where one sits, seems to apply exceptionally to his case. The minute he ended up in New Delhi, the kind of whole paradigm got shifted, inverted on its head. And starting with the one nation, one X kind of sloganeering, which this administration is very famous for or infamous for, the whole fallacy of homogenization being the basis for growth or standardization being the basis for efficiency started to get implemented one after the other. I've had cause to remark that one nation, one ration card is particularly hard to implement. In Tamil Nadu, for example, in our public distribution system, we have 7 tiers of cards that get different types of benefits, and very few of them get things like wheat. Whereas most of our migrant workers come from the northern states, and they eat very little rice, which is the biggest component of our public distribution system through the ration shops. And most of them eat a lot of wheat, for which we don't even normally have adequate supply. So, it's hard to standardize across the country when a state itself has 7 different types of cards. There are any number of examples, but I don't want to dull the point by repeated examples. The second shift of this, I would say, is on the financial side, and there it has been dramatic. So not just with the onset of GST, which effectively removed the power of taxation or the bulk of the power of taxation from the states. The constitution already left the overwhelming majority of direct taxation with the union, and a small portion of that, and probably 2/3 of the indirect taxation with the states. And after GST, I would say over 75–80% of indirect taxation is also with the union itself. But also, as pointed out, a dramatic shift towards cess and surcharge, which now make up something like 23% of the entire revenues of the union government, and therefore are not divided between the states, to the states. Now, this is particularly galling for states like Tamil Nadu, or for that matter, Maharashtra, where for every rupee of taxes we pay in, on estimate, we get, depending on the state, Maharashtra about 20 paise and Tamil Nadu about 35 paise back. So the more the government takes into the cess, then it's further, reducing that number, and it starts to become a bit lopsided. Now, in all federal societies, there are net transfers of assets and funds from better off to worse off sub-entities. But in most other societies, those transfers tend to narrow the gap. In India, the greater the transfers, the further the gap seems to rise. Every year, every decade, the gap between the better off states and the less well-off states keeps on expanding, and there seems to be no end in sight. This shift to the centralization of taxes has been accompanied by a deep intrusion into the delivery of benefits as well. So a recent paper, and in fact, it's on the government's website, so we don't need to quote any other data. The government's websites on direct benefit transfer shows that what was almost zero in direct benefit transfers from the union to people in 2014, last year was about 5.25 crores, or 1.5 times the size of the budget of Tamil Nadu. So the union not only takes 100% of petrol and diesel taxes and the bulk of all other taxes and 23% of total revenues and cesses and 58% or 59% of the income taxes and the GST. And then this decides to bypass the state and the local bodies and go directly to the people as far as possible. Now, of course, we know that this fallacy that, one man or two men sitting as God can direct outcomes is proven to be kind of extreme fallacy every day, because we see not just the failure of schemes like, the Swachh schemes or the Krish Kalyan schemes, where the money doesn't get used properly or gets returned because funds for whitewashing buildings are not used when there are no buildings to whitewash, when schools are run in thatched huts, or when toilets are built but they don't have water supply because that's the municipal administration's responsibility, or even outright scams like the PM Kisan scams we've seen in Tamil Nadu, where thousands of crores sometimes have been stolen through outright fraud and forgery, and the union government doesn't seem particularly well equipped to catch it. And in the case of our predecessors, neither was the state government. The last point I'll make in terms of concrete shift in the dilution of federalism is about data. With the aggressive use of Aadhar, which itself has all kinds of limitations in terms of the court's mandates, but whether they're followed or not is a different story. There's also the whole question of the lack of data purity or data integrity, that so many false records have been introduced into the system that even a positive match of a retina or a fingerprint may not mean anything, because enough false records are there that might be an arbitrary record that you then validate with the biometrics. But most of all, it is the use of this data that seems to have no kind of conception of federalism. The union government owns the bulk of this data. It uses it whichever way it wants. It feeds it to its partners, like the Jio phone company, in ways that are, questionable about the separation of, public versus private entities. And yet, states don't have access to this data nearly as well as private entities like Jio do. I'll, 2 or 3 other examples: the whole electoral bond model, where only the union government agencies know, and therefore the union government knows. So the rest of us don't know who gives the money, where it comes from, kind of institutionalized corruption, if you will, or rent seeking. The income tax data, which again, very few of us have adequate access to, where we decide to have a means test for our benefits. And even something as basic as the vaccination data, which required all the inputs to be put into the CoWIN portal, but the states did not have access to at least the granular data. We didn't have any access at all. When we finally asked and repeated, we were given at a gross level, at like a district or a city level, but that doesn't help us. When we want to do pandemic kind of countering, we have to know street by street, block by block, where the gaps are in vaccine penetration, and overlay that with the antibody sampling and with the kind of demographic modeling to know where are the high-risk groups, but we don't have access to the data. So it's ironic that we find that those who have the data either don't use it or use it, immorally, if not outright illegitimately. And then the rest of us who actually could use the data and legitimately use it to benefit our efficiency and delivery of our schemes don't have access to the data. Now, the question that's always lingered in my mind is, it's one thing for non-BJP states like, BJP government states like West Bengal or Tamil Nadu to kind of rail against this and our political philosophy and our federalism principles are aligned with the current situation. I've always wondered why it is that the BJP states who suffer just as bad outcomes, whether it is Gujarat or UP or Karnataka or any of these, why are they not champing, at the bit and saying, this is no good for us. We don't have access. We are powerless. We are beholden to the efficiency or lack thereof of your execution. We want to be masters of our own destiny, at least as far as the Constitution provides. And I've started to think that maybe we're reaching a breaking point on that, in the sense that, of course, the organizational strength and capabilities of the RSS and of the Hindutva ecosystem are far superior at a national level, at least to anybody else. Many of us are regional parties, and the once national party of the Congress is not anywhere at the organization capability that the RSS and the BJP have. So it is that organizational strength that has kept the system under suppression. But even that, I think we're starting to see the limits of that. Both in the GST Council, where I'm a member, I'm starting to see even BJP states start to question whether this kind of centralization of power and decision-making and lack of access and input to the states is a sustainable model. And I think we have also seen that through the kind of political turmoil in places like Karnataka and places like Uttarakhand, Gujarat, where the regime change within the party has had to be facilitated once or twice or multiple times, shows you that maybe the system is starting to creak. And the natural tendency for all human beings to want to be free, to be with self-respect, to have some control of their destiny, to have self-determination, is starting to rise and bubble up, even through the massive kind of organizational suppression skills of the RSS and the BJP. So with that, I'll leave it there and just look forward to learning from the views of the other panelists. And then if there are any questions that I can jump in at the end, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you.